Welcome to Activate Your Introvert, the weekly radio show to uncover and unlock the entrepreneurial skills in your business. In this week's show, hybrid working and the Channel Tunnel, thinking about what that means for you as a leader. The thorny old myth about public speaking and introverts, and an interview with Simon Raybould. Simon is a presentation consultant who makes it more likely that your presentations will have impact without freaking you out in the process. Just before speaking to Simon, did you know it was 30 years ago this month that engineers from Britain and France met under the English Channel? After lots of digging, the transformation of cross-channel travel was made real. Odd to think about travel to France without the tunnel now, as reports of HGVs queuing in Kent will attest. It made me think about the meeting of two great cultures and transformation. Not quite as dramatic is the meeting of two methods, home working and office working, with the new third way, hybrid working, those who are doing both. Meetings are often the way different personality types meet, and like the Channel Tunnel, there will be a new paradigm in the way we work when it comes to meetings. It's forming today. I was recently speaking at a conference on improving hybrid working. The general point we were discussing was that the solution to better hybrid working, from a leadership perspective, is not more technology. The issue is the thorny old one. Two different approaches to work, the introvert and the extrovert. So if you're looking to get your team to connect better and be more effective in, I've got to say it once this year and once only, the new normal, then you need to focus on the people. Some people crave contact and attention a face-to-face meeting brings. Without other ways of expressing that exuberance can explode out in a meeting. And there's plenty of that happening right now. But block that from happening, and you could be stopping your extroverts from working effectively. On the other hand, in a remote meeting, it's much harder to interrupt a louder colleague than when face-to-face. In a mixed meeting, some in the office, some remote, it's even worse because some people are grabbing the attention of each other and some people, of course, are remote. Be conscious of that different dynamic. Adjust your meetings to suit introvert, extrovert, and everybody in between. You're going to need some elements of more structure and perhaps some elements of non-structure. If you want to discuss ways of improving your whole team working, I'd love to chat more. Meanwhile, I'm booking my Eurostar tickets in the hope of driving under the sea to go skiing next year. Do let me know what tip you'd like to activate the entrepreneurial skills in your business, or what introvert myth you'd like exposed. Drop me an email, give me a call, or add it as a comment to your review on the iTunes store. I'd love to hear from you. But now it's time for this week's interview. Welcome, Simon.
Hi, I am really looking forward to this. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it as well, because I know that we've spoken about presentations in the past, and this piece about storytelling. I hear so many people saying, "Oh, just tell stories," and I'm never convinced it's good. But perhaps we'll come on to that in a second if we can. Mm-hmm. Just really quickly, are you an introvert or an extrovert, and what does it mean to you?
I'm introvert. I'm very introvert. I'm so introvert that I don't want to answer that question. Thank you very much. There's a whole level of introversion out there.
That's nice, and that's a really good answer. You don't have to answer it.
Well, I think
because in a way you have.
To be fair to folks, I probably ought to add something, which is that I found it absolutely liberating when I was, quotes, diagnosed, end quotes, as an introvert, because it meant I realized, okay, there's a name for it. I'm not bonkers. I'm not crazy. There's a tool, there's a label, and I'm actually normal. I just don't work the same way as those people around me work.
Mm. And I think that's really interesting, because I still find lots of people where I'll have a discussion with them and they have that same light bulb moment that you just described. So I think that's really important. Yeah.
But rather than talking about that, let's talk about presentations. What is it that stops most presentations from having an impact?
It's because they are not designed to have an impact. Most presentations are designed to make the presenter feel safe and to cover their bases. They are defensive presentations, and there's not a cat in hell's chance, therefore, of them succeeding. The analogy I want to use here is a really crass, generalized male one, which is it's like a football team that plays all 11 people on the defensive. The best you can hope for under those circumstances is a draw, a no-score draw. You can never win. The best you can do is not lose. Most presentations are like that. They are designed to not lose. Nobody takes risks. Nobody knows what they're trying to do with the presentations, and nobody pushes forward on the attack. They just defend, defend, defend.
So that implies, one, be clear on what you want to do with the presentation, and then push it forward a bit.
Absolutely. So you need to know what the presentation is supposed to change. At the end of your presentation, in what way is the world supposed to be a better place?
That's a nice clear.
Yeah, it's not hard, is it? It's not hard. And yet most people's idea of preparing for a presentation is, how can I figure out what to tell the audience so that I don't look stupid?
Yeah. So where does the storytelling come into this then?
Oh, I'm about to get on my soapbox, and it's a good job this is a podcast, because otherwise I'd have a nosebleed about it. Storytelling is a tool within presenting. It's a massively powerful tool within presenting, but it's not the silver bullet. It doesn't slay every monster that you're coming across, I'm afraid. What storytelling does is allow you to get your message across quite quickly, and it allows you to engage with the audience, but there are lots and lots and lots of other ways of doing that as well. So, for example, we talk a lot in presentations about the fact that people remember stuff if it's delivered to them in a pattern. Stories have patterns. Stories are a form of pattern, and that's great. But to say that stories are the answer just ignores the fact that there are a million other ways of developing pattern as well. To talk about the fact that stories are the only way of developing rapport with your audience, yes, they can develop rapport with your audience, but there are a million other ways of doing it as well. So they're a tool, but they are only one tool. They're a massively powerful tool. They're an underrated tool. And I recommend that people start telling stories in their presentations all the time, but they're not the only tool. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, that's fine. I'm intrigued now, because I'm looking at this from an introvert perspective, and introverts often don't want to talk much about themselves. Perhaps they'll talk more, therefore, about facts. So would it be fair to say introverts are less likely to like telling stories, or is that?
I think they're often more reluctant to tell stories because they quite often have a mindset. This is a generalization, of course, I get it, but they quite often have a mindset of let the facts speak for themselves. And they have a mindset of, I don't want to declare, I'm a private person. One of the definitions of an introvert includes the phrases private and self-contained. And yet going on stage and telling stories about themselves, and here when I say stage, I mean the front of the boardroom as well. Telling stories about themselves seems alien, perhaps because they've never done it, perhaps because they don't want to do it, because it feels embarrassingly discursive. Maybe they don't want to do it because it feels egocentric, or maybe they don't want to do it just because they don't have the skills for doing it. So there's lots of different reasons why they don't want to do it, perhaps.
But I assume it's not egocentric if you're, I guess, using the story to explain your point, rather than just standing there and telling a story because you've got a big ego.
Bingo. You've just used the word that really lights my fire. You've used the word using. So we are talking here about using stories. We're not talking about telling stories. We're sure as hell not telling stories for the sake of it. We're using stories to get a point across. The only people who tell stories for the sake of it are mind-numbingly selfish, self-obsessed egomaniacs. Everybody else tells a story to make a point, to help their audience in some way. Even, let me be brave about this, I want you to cast your mind back to when you were a kid. Did somebody read you bedtime stories?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Now, your parents or whoever brought you up didn't read you bedtime stories for the sake of reading you bedtime stories. They told you a bedtime story to get you to calm down and go to sleep. So even under those circumstances, stories were being used, not told. So I talk a lot about this concept of the reluctant storyteller. And I talk about the ways of teaching people to use stories rather than telling stories.
So if I wanted to improve my presentations, I ought to think about using storytelling as a vehicle to get my point across. If I was introverted as well, what kind of things would I need to be thinking about?
Well, for introverts, the obvious thing to do is that you don't have to tell stories about yourself. They can be stories, and indeed they probably should be stories about other people. From the audience's perspective, that doesn't set up the barrier between you and them. Okay, so stories about other people. Honestly, even if it's a story about yourself, all you have to do is preface it with a friend of mine, and you can tell the story without it sounding quite so egocentric.
But what friend of mine went to the doctor, that one.
That's the one, yes. Yeah. I need so asking for a friend.
Yeah.
But we talk about something called the Jackanory fire, which is where we collect stories left, right, and centre. I don't know if your audience is old enough to remember Jackanory. It was a kids' TV program.
I remember it.
Dedicated to storytelling, right? So we have what we call a Jackanory fire, where we just collect stories left, right, and centre. And then when we need a story to make a point, we have got a reservoir of stories that we can go to and look at and go, this story X, illustrates point Y perfectly. And you put those two things together. So you make a conscious decision about which stories to tell. And the big thing to remember, of course, is that you never tell a story about anybody in the audience.
Towards the end of the discussion, I normally like to just ask for a tip for an introvert, but also a tip for a non-introvert to perhaps get the message over more clearly to introverts.
Let's start with the extrovert one. Mm-hmm. If you can tell your story without words, so much the better. So the best stories are the ones that people make up for themselves inside their own heads. The famous example of that was Ernest Hemingway's 6-word short story. I know Hemingway didn't write it, but let's pretend he did. And that short story is For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. And that whole story is the backstory of why somebody would be selling baby shoes that have never been worn. That's made up in the audience's head. So you don't actually have to tell the story. You just have to give something that makes the audience figure out the story for itself. And
That's really clever.
And the one for introverts is practice storytelling. I know that sounds really simple, but as we're all online at the moment, there's no reason why you can't practice with a pretend audience. Practice talking to the camera so that by the time you're talking to the camera with an audience, there is no problem because you're absolutely used to it.
Simon, I'm sure some of the listeners will want to get back in touch with you. How can they do that?
There's a brand new project coming in the new year, and you can sign up for the updates for that because it's not ready yet. Sign up for the updates at reluctant.presentationgenius.info. So reluctant.presentationgenius.info. And that will just take you to a sign-up page with a little bit of information about the Reluctant Storyteller project and an option to sign up to be kept up to date about it. You don't pay anything for that. You're not committed to anything for that. It's just a way of being kept in the loop.
That's fantastic. Simon, thank you so much for your time today. It's been brilliant talking to you.
I loved it. My pleasure, as always.
And now it's time for Introvert Myth of the Week. Those crazy stories that I hear and you hear that some people actually believe. The obvious myth which comes to mind after chatting to Simon is that introverts don't like public speaking. It keeps doing the round. In 1 BC, I was often told, no, I'm not 1 BC, that 1 BC, I meant the 1 year before COVID. I was often told, when on stage in front of an audience, that I couldn't be an introvert as I love public speaking and I love being on stage. It wasn't true then, and it isn't now. Although, maybe it's different as we present to camera. Introversion has nothing to do with speaking, albeit that after a few hours at a conference, I may feel exhausted. The good news for introverts is that as a speaker, it's not about you. It's about your audience, helping them, serving them, making them think. Now, there's a thought. Thank you for listening to Activate Your Introvert, and I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I'd love to see your reviews on the iTunes store. thank you once again and catch up with you next week.